Welcome, chosen ones. Disappearing without drama is the most dangerous move you can do, since being silent with strategy is more effective than screaming. They did not hear the door close after you. There will be no tantrums, warnings, or last speeches. Just poof, gone. But there's a twist. You didn't just walk out. You prepared your departure like a seasoned director assembling the last scene of a blockbuster narrative twist. The deceit was planned. Their ego was the camera. And you with a calm, dazzling storm in heels or sneakers, pulling it all together while sipping tea like a light, careless about the camera. And let us be honest, some of you deserve an Academy Award, a standing ovation, and a 3-part Netflix documentary for surviving the toxic circus without breaking a single nail. However, here is where things become more tricky. Psychologists believe that people do not change unless they have had enough hardship or clarity. You had both. Instead of exploding, you chose something more worse for your opponents. You planned, prepared, and performed. Your exit was not emotional. It was clever. It wasn't loud. It was legendary. So today, we'll look at what most people don't see behind the scenes of your leaving. Discipline and deception. Yep. Strategic silence is essential. The mental chess you played while believing you were still in the game, and how your last move haunts them more than 1,000 confrontations ever could. Buckle up. The selected one. This isn't about survival. It's about spiritual espionage. Let us get to the very real causes. Your departure was not merely clean. It was cosmic-level choreography. And, oh yes, they're still saying it as if they just departed or we were duped. Number 1, you did not just walk away. You set up a psychological trap that they fell into. You didn't just forsake them. You put up a psychological trap so subtle that they had no clue they were falling into it. While they were striving to persuade you, you were 2 steps ahead, setting the stage for your departure. They believed they had control, but you were silently collecting emotional data, observing patterns, and taking mental notes while smiling in their way. Every lie they said, every shift in energy, every bogus apology. You observed everything, but said nothing. This was some of the brilliance. You wanted them to be comfortable enough to show their hand. You didn't call it out. You let it grow. This was not an emotional decision. You weren't just exhausted. You were focused. You stayed calm despite your anguish because your mind had already started to prepare your road to release. You led them to assume they still had access to you. You continued to reply to messages, show up when needed, and do your part just enough to avoid suspicion. That's what made it so engaging. They didn't understand you were finished. You moved as if you were still engaged. However, spiritually, you had already passed. You planned your leave like it was a mission. You started setting limitations. They didn't notice. You began arranging your next moves quietly. You did not pound on the door. You kept it slightly open since you knew the truth would eventually emerge on its own. That's what made your departure so poetic. You didn't fight for closure. You allowed them the opportunity to express their whole dysfunction while capturing the breakdown and moving like a ghost ready to go. They were surprised when it finally happened. There are no screaming goodbyes or pleadings, simply a clean cut. You had already left by the time they spotted it. You had already outgrown everything. Your cognitive talents had grown. Your emotions had caught up. And your spirit has already entered a new season. They don't understand this. You left for more than a second. It was a masterpiece. And they're still stunned since they didn't expect it. You didn't just walk out. You observed, waited, and then executed. This was not an escape. That was power in action. And it was perfect. Number 2, your leaving was not an escape. It was the actualization of a strategic revelation. Your exit was more than simply leaving. It was about ensuring that the story was not twisted after you departed. You knew exactly what they would do after you left. Spin it. Play the victim. Make it seem that you were unstable, spiteful, or just bitter. Instead of hurrying away, you planned your departure as a careful, controlled revelation. You did not have to destroy them. You merely wanted to go in such a clear, intentional way that anyone who looked back would understand why you left without having to explain it. You realized that the truth had a bigger impact when it was revealed on its own. So you stopped explaining. You stopped reacting to the chaos. You became calmer and more alert. You began to let their behaviors speak for themselves, sparing your own energy. You allowed the dysfunction to develop until it could no longer be concealed. And you didn't rush it. You let time work for you. This is what makes it so effective. You weren't in a haste to flee. You were waiting for an appropriate occasion to make your absence significant. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a subtle buildup to something obvious. You were laying the basis for truth. To have the loudest voice, you didn't reveal them. They exposed themselves. You merely provided them the room to do so. And while they were still underestimating your anguish, you were almost out the door with your dignity, receipts, and sense of direction intact. People who had previously been swayed by their appeal started to ask questions. People who had before questioned your version of events started to see what you saw. That's just what you wanted. Not to win the discussion, but to exit in such a forceful, thoughtful way that the facts started to emerge after you departed. You didn't break their mask. You just walked away, releasing the mask without raising a finger. What bothered them was more than just your absence. It was that you didn't have to shout, battle, or beg. Your absence was more effective than your presence. It exposed the truth more plainly than any confrontation could. That's why they're still bothered by how you departed. Because they realize you didn't just leave. You submitted the final proof. Number 3, you were aware they were watching. So you turned your breakup into a broadcast. You knew they were watching you, so you made certain your exit was more than just clean. It was unforgettable. You turned it into a must-see performance. Every step you took was purposeful. You weren't just leaving. You were silently documenting your way out. You led them to feel they were still in command. They are still the puppet masters. While you diligently recovered all aspects of yourself, you made your progress apparent enough for others to see it, but private enough that they never got the whole picture. That is why it hit so strongly. You didn't run away. You vocally developed. You gave indications with your enthusiasm, limitations, and stillness. You didn't have to debate or explain yourself. Your actions expressed the whole story, and everyone was paying attention. Those who were previously bewildered about you started to see the truth just by watching how you carried yourself. That wasn't luck. That was exact. While they believed they still had control of the tale, you were creating a whole new one. You made sure that people could connect the dots without you having to spell them out. You led them to feel they were still in command. They are still the puppet masters. While you diligently recovered all aspects of yourself, you made your progress apparent enough for others to see it, but private enough that they never got the whole picture. That is why it hit so strongly. You didn't run away. You vocally developed. You gave indications with your enthusiasm, limitations, and stillness. You didn't have to debate or explain yourself. Your actions expressed the whole story, and everyone was paying attention. Those who were previously bewildered about you started to see the truth just by watching how you carried yourself. That wasn't luck. That was exact. While they believed they still had control of the tale, you were creating a whole new one. You made sure that people could connect the dots without you having to spell them out. You did not post rants. You did not throw any shadow. However, your brilliance, tranquility, and level have all increased. It spurred others to make inquiry. And whenever they tried to speak about you, they sounded more bitter, unstable, and vulnerable. The beauty of your leave was how carefree it seemed. But underneath that calm was someone who had seen enough chaos to know not to match their excitement. You encouraged them to keep looking because the more they searched, the more obvious it became that they were the problem. They expected you to spiral, return sobbing, and beg, but you moved like someone who recognized their worth and had already outgrown the circumstance. That is what causes it to burn. You turned your departure into a silent broadcast, a live testimony. They were on alert every day, seeking for signs of weakness, but all they saw was strength. You didn't just walk away. You demonstrate what true power looks like when there is no need to prove it. They are no longer able to unsee it. Number 4, you persuaded them to feel they were still winning while you sealed their fate. They thought they were still winning. They believed they had you just where they wanted you. Confused, weak, dependent, and silent. But you weren't frozen. You were focused. You weren't lost. You were loading. You convinced them that they were still in control because you understood something they never would. Emotional and impulsive, and this gives them power. Strategic stillness eliminates it. You smiled despite the betrayal. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you didn't want to waste a single move reacting to a game you'd already decided to leave. You saw through every insult, lie, and attempt to push your buttons, yet you remained cool. You realized that the emotional explosion they were seeking for would just give them with a story to tell. You didn't give them anything to twist. You were silent but not inactive. You recorded every encounter, trend, and double standard. They all became part of the internal archive you were building while they thought they were getting away with it. You were gaining wisdom, strength, and clarity. And while they believed you were still under their spell, they revealed more about themselves. Louder, nastier, sloppier. You did not rush. You enabled them to fully reveal themselves. You recognized that the last move needed to be surgical. No mess, no drama. Simply leave with receipts and a refreshed sense of self. By the time you departed, you had changed. You had mastered the art of blossoming from disarray without bringing attention to it. You had transformed your sorrow into precision. You gave them the sense that they were in control till the end. And when you finally sliced them off, it was so clean and perfect. They didn't have time to defend themselves. That's what broke them. They weren't only surprised when you left. They were disturbed by how you did it. Because, to be honest, they had no clue what was coming. They imagined you were engrossed in their play. Meanwhile, you were solidifying their fate with each quiet step toward your departure. And now they have to figure out how they lost a game that they thought they were winning. Number 5, you exploited their preconceived notions and utilized them as a cover. They thought they had you figured out. They felt you were too sensitive, vulnerable, and naive to ever really walk away. And that is exactly what you wanted people to believe. Their arrogance became your armor. Their preconceptions offered an excellent diversion. You made them feel they were the sharpest person in the room while discreetly scrutinizing every error, slip-up, and flaw. They assumed they had the upper hand, but all they had was a false sense of security, one that you purposely let them keep. Your naivete became a costume. You used astonishment as a disguise. You seemed helpless when required, not because you were weak, but because you were strategic. You let them undress to meet your intelligence, strength, and understanding. They believed you were imprisoned, overwhelmed, and dependent, but you were really paying attention, accumulating emotional data, and devising your escape plan in plain sight. You did not make a notification about your progress. You grew quietly, under the radar, while others thrived. Your silence was not due to fear. It was set up. You let them dig their own grave. Take one action at a time. You noticed every time they lied. Every time they impacted you, you saw a pattern. You led them to feel they were still winning. You stay the center of your world. While you were gently eliminating energy from each component of the connection, they observed that you become quieter. They thought they'd broken you. What they didn't realize was that you were backing off because you were almost done. They had no idea there was a backdoor. You had no notion that every stride they took in their pretend superiority was really pushing you closer to freedom. You were the architect of your escape, and they were too arrogant to see the construction happening right in front of their eyes when you finally walked. It was more than just a shock for them. It embarrassed them because they had to admit that the person they despised, ignored, or looked down on had completely outmaneuvered them. You did not question their prejudices. You used them. And in doing so, you changed their whole concept of control, which is why they never saw your power coming. Number 6, you used their own narcissism as a distraction. You realized early on that the key to leaving them was not to address their ego. Technology included letting technology do the work for you. Their obsession with being the center of attention, being admired, praised, and always accurate blinded them to what was really important. They did not pay attention to you. They gazed on the mirror. This is why you were able to observe without suspicion. Instead of a camera, you were capturing their performance with your sharpest memories and clearest inner vision you've ever had. They were so caught up in their own tale that they didn't see you retreating emotionally. They were too focused with making their disguise seem perfect to the outside world. That egocentric need to be immaculate became your cover. You did your part absolutely well to maintain their focus on you. You supplemented when required. You maintained silence when necessary. You gave them the idea that you were still in the relationship while progressively withdrawing from it mentally. The truth is, you didn't need to deceive them. They misled themselves. Their ego demanded a larger audience than they could have envisioned. You were only cheering to keep the show going while you mustered your confidence. You knew they wouldn't notice your detachment since they had never been really linked to you in the first place. They were fixated on their own reflection. And you let them stay high on that fantasy while you took notes. You learn about their manipulation cycles. You saw their tactics of blame shifting, guilt tripping, and gaslighting. You did not interrupt the program. You studied it. You pretended to be the puppeteer while quietly sliding out of the strings and stood backstage, waiting for the appropriate moment to take anything they assumed you didn't see. They were caught off guard when you finally left. Not because they admired you, but because they had lost their core audience. They never expected you to have the courage to depart. That's how deep their arrogance went. But you were never really imprisoned. You just waited long enough for them to get deceived by their own ego. You made your covert planned departure totally informed, prepared, and carried out. Seventh, you didn't burn any bridges. You allowed them to burn themselves while maintaining a safe distance with a matchbook. You did not have to shout, expose, or drag them through the mud. That's not your style. You knew the truth was powerful enough to compel you to do things you didn't want to do. So instead of starting flames, you let them to ignite on their own. Again and again. Until they found themselves standing in the ashes, puzzled at how everything had crumbled. You were never the destroyer. You were only a witness who ultimately stopped holding up the walls for them. There were no stunning departures. There is no scorched earth. Just a peaceful, tidy break that left everyone wondering how someone so calm, courteous, and consistent could go with no bad feelings. That's what stood out the most. You didn't come out swinging. You have just exited. In doing so, you left a silence that spoke louder than any confrontation. People were intrigued because of the silence. People started asking questions about them rather than you. You did not need to share anything. You just left them alone with the calamity they sought to conceal. Reality started to creep through the cracks as your energy was no longer necessary to keep the illusion going. Without your presence to soften them, the lies they said would break apart. The narrative they provided began to shatter the moment you stepped beyond the frame. That's what happens when your honesty is the only thing keeping their mask together. You did not desire revenge. You were interested in peace. The punishment was to walk away without regret, not because it hurt them, but because it forced them to face what they had projected upon you. You became the mirror they sought to avoid. And by the time they realized the injury was created by them rather than you, they had already felt the repercussions of their own acts. Did you leave with a matchbook? Yes, but you never started a fire. They completed everything on their own. You just moved back far enough to escape being caught in the flames. And as the smoke rises, people start to realize why you ran. And they're understanding that you weren't the problem. You were the evidence. Number 8, you played long enough that the withdrawal seemed inadvertent. They looked at you, assuming you were finished, worn out, emotionally damaged, and maybe too feeble to survive without them. And you made them assume that you had bought into their deception. You gave them just enough silence, suffering, and stillness to make them believe they had finally drained you of all your power. However, while they saw you through the lens of their ego, you were able to move across the gaps. They hadn't realized you could fit through. You weren't weak. You were reasonable. You knew that if you made a lot of noise, they'd have to work harder to find you. So you did the opposite. You claimed to be invisible. You stopped resisting. Not because you gave up, but because you conserved energy. You made them believe you had surrendered. But deep down, you were rebuilding in ways that others couldn't see. You were recuperating in secret. You were reclaiming parts of yourself that they had tried to destroy. And they continued to laugh, taunt, and be arrogant. You were securing your departure. You did not give them a spectacular performance. You didn't need a spectacular exit that would have allowed them to label you as insane, emotional, or unstable. Instead, you made the departure appear as a gentle fade, which they barely noticed until you were gone. That was the genius behind your approach. You moved quietly. You did not proclaim your evolution. You just stepped right into it. While they were preoccupied with their own self-importance, they noticed that you were not only physically distant, but also psychologically, spiritually, and emotionally detached. They tried to re-engage, agitate, and draw you back into old patterns, but you'd already reached the point of no return. You had healed beyond their axis. They are still trying to figure out when you slipped away. The beauty of it is that the version of you they thought was broken was actually the correct version, creating a new life behind the curtain. You didn't just leave. You disappeared on purpose. And now all they have is bewilderment and a harsh realization that the perceived weakness was actually the plan that set you free. Number 9, you led them to believe they had rejected you when, in fact, you were ensuring you would never have to look back. They believed they had turned you off. They believed they had final say. They assumed they dumped you as if you were disposable. And that is exactly what you wanted people to believe. You knew their ego couldn't stop feeling powerful, even if it meant being the one to walk away. So you set the trap. You postponed your reactions. You retreated just enough to make them think you were losing interest. You stopped arguing about talks, defending yourself, and reacting to their drama. You offered them stillness, but they mistook it for weakness. Perfect. You realized how much they desired control. You knew they couldn't continue to feel like they were losing you. So you played your cards wisely. You led them to believe they were the ones pulling the plug. You made them feel in command even though you were already halfway out the door, emotionally packed and mentally moved on. You gave them the impression of authority, which made the actual escape easier, cleaner, final. They thought you were heartbroken. They predicted that you would spiral. They awaited the breakdown, apologies, and the frantic call. But none arrived because you were already free. You did not want to go back inside. You had prepared for this moment long before they knew it was approaching. You had already wept. Your last tears shed behind closed doors signified that you had already faced the pain and finished the inner work. When they returned to check whether they still had a hold on you, they found a closed door and a version of you they couldn't recognize. They thought they'd rejected you, but you were the one who gave them the platform. You knew exactly how they'd perform on it. They wanted to feel like the winner. So you handed them the fake trophy, exited the stage, and started a new life without an audience. You were not rejected. Rather, you were released. And that was not a power play. That was your magnificent scheme. You didn't lose the thing. You have gained everything. Clarification, healing, and liberty. Most importantly, you learn about yourself. This was the genuine win, and they will never have the chance to play that game with you again. Number 10, you made your recuperation appear so easy. It made them unhappy. They thought that shattering you would be the apex of their story. They expected you to stay in that dark place, reliving the experience, wallowing in self-doubt, and maybe asking to return. They wanted you to lose yourself completely. They imagined you breaking apart for years, barely functioning, and incapable of healing without their approval. They didn't anticipate your fortitude, however. They underestimated how much you could bleed and yet recover as if nothing had happened. They did not see the silent war you fought through restless nights and trembling prayers. Breathing was tough at times. You weren't just healing. You were building from the ground up alone, without an audience or applause. It's just you, your scars, God, and the unflinching will to not be broken. You remained silent about it. You did not publicize every stage of your return. You allowed the process to cleanse you in secret, while the rest of the world thought you were still damaged. Then you emerged calm, grounded, and radiant. Not because you wanted to prove anything, but because you had been healed. The brightness people see now is not from cosmetics or a filter. That's superhuman strength disguised as serenity. That is information embedded throughout your tone. That is clarity in your boundaries, grace in your silence, power in your presence. They're furious because they don't get it. How could someone they had fought so hard to break become even more strong? How could they forsake somebody, show up sparkling, lucky, and focused as ever? They did not expect you to prosper. They expected you to drag your feet, bitter, devastated, and yet in anguish. But instead, they saw you smiling. It shook them. The effortlessness gets right under their skin, because they know it wasn't easy. They know you gave your best. This makes your peace even more hazardous. You didn't just survive what they did. You made it seem amazing. Now, your healing is louder than theirs. Your light represents your revenge, and your enthusiasm demonstrates that their idea did not just fail. It backfired. A number. You did not just leave a circumstance. You left a whole psychological blueprint behind. You assumed you were only trying to survive. I'm just trying to make it out unharmed. But without realizing it, you were a pattern, a quiet guideline for walking away with dignity while everything around you was striving to wreak havoc. Your departure wasn't simply about you. It became a signal, a genuine proof that you may walk out of craziness without matching its wrath. People saw that there were others watching, some close by, some far away, who had been trapped in similar cycles, questioning their sanity, feeling imprisoned, perplexed, and afraid to flee. They'd been taught that leaving had to be theatrical, that they should uncover everything, confront every lie, and completely wreck the house. But then they saw you remained calm, focused, and unshaken. You didn't provide a dramatic speech. You didn't exacerbate anyone's pain. You just moved with purpose, gradually withdrawing from the system that was draining you. Your silence became a strategy. Your limit became a lesson. Your leaving became proof. You may not have realized it, but your failure to retaliate was an example of leadership. You refused to stoop to their level. The way you valued peace above performance. That triggered something to alter in the people watching from the sidelines. You taught them that sometimes the most powerful statement of self-worth is to just go without explanation. You proved that going away quietly is not an indication of weakness. It is power. And it's the kind that echoes. You did not have to submit a thorough account. You did not need a crowd since you picked your own sanity. You created a quiet blueprint. Others could follow. You proved that you do not have to explode to escape. You may leave with a plan. You may succeed without sacrificing your soul. And now, because of how you handled it, someone else understands they are not imprisoned. They just wanted to see someone do things differently. You did. And you made it look not just plausible, but also forceful. You turned the emotional onslaught into a lesson in sovereignty. They thought they'd broken you. They predicted that the lies, emotional roller coasters, subtle jabs, and constant shifting of blame would force you to become disoriented and forget who you were. But they didn't realize you weren't simply surviving it. You were studying it. Every insult, quarrel, and confusing contact was quietly documented in your own archive. You weren't answering. You were remembering. You weren't lost. You were learning. They used gaslighting to try to modify your reality. They skewed facts, rejected what you knew were true, and made you question your own convictions. But you eventually saw the pattern. You started to see how the truth was always altering to protect their ego. That revelation triggered a switch. You stopped seeking to prove your truth and started to accept your own point of view. That was your first act of sovereignty, choosing the truth above their performance. Then came the triangulation. Games with others. The comparisons, the subtle attempts to make you feel inferior instead of falling for it. You witnessed it. You saw how they used division to maintain power. You stopped competing. You disconnected from the drama. And in that detachment, you reclaimed control. The sabotage, when they silently tried to make you fail or doubt yourself, was the ultimate training ground. Instead of internalizing the attacks, you saw the insecurity that motivated their behavior. That shift in perspective impacted everything. You stopped personalizing their approaches and instead viewed them as reflections of who they really were. That clarity became your armor. You didn't just walk away from abuse. You alchemized it. You converted it into knowledge and emotional intelligence that no book could provide you. You came out the other side with more insight, better boundaries, and a strong sense of self. While they thought they were keeping you in a loop, they were really training you for a level of sovereignty that they would never attain. You didn't just survive what they did. You have decrypted it. You are now not just free, but also wiser, calmer, and more aware than you have ever been. That's what scares me most. You didn't come out broken. You turned out fantastically. A number. You played foolish long enough to become intelligent without interruption. They believed you did not understand it. They thought the manipulation was effective, that you were too bewildered, emotionally invested, and ignorant to see the game for what it was. But you were not in the fog. You were fully awake. Simply silence. You led them to assume you were in the dark, because the misconception gave you the ability to advance without resistance. They were laughing behind your back, certain that they could get away with anything. You sat quietly, connecting the dots. They hadn't even realized they were on the page. You did not take the time to answer each falsehood. You didn't quarrel over every alteration in their storyline. You let them to talk and focused on their energy, patterns, and inconsistencies rather than their words. You saw how they grew defensive when you questioned them, how they transformed your concerns into attacks, and how their version of events always made them the victim. You weren't lost. You were documenting. You were making a psychological profile. Each contradiction helped you acquire clarity. They believed you were foolish since you didn't react. But in reality, you were too wise to waste energy on meaningless battles. You knew they wanted chaos. You knew they lived on ambiguity and emotional responses. So you calmed them down. You gave them ignorance. You made them feel invulnerable and superior. I'm confident you wouldn't figure it out. That was your shield. Your silence did not suggest doubt. It was cover. Your patience was not a weakness. It was a calculation. You made mental maps. You followed the exits and noticed the cycles. You were not going to stay. You just did not want to leave on their terms. You wanted to leave with peace, dignity, and a firm understanding that you would never fall for that dynamic again. It was not an unexpected decision on your side to go. It was the last step in a process that they were unaware had started. They're still trying to figure out how you did it, how you went from helpless to cured, perplexed to untouchable. But you know the truth. You played foolish long enough to become intelligent without interruption. And now you see everything fully, and you will never return. A number. Your leaving was not a goodbye. It was a graduation. Your departure was not a negative answer. It was not a breakdown or an emotional desire. It was a breakthrough. You didn't storm out. You climbed. You didn't run. You rose. As you went away, they saw you transform into a version of yourself that couldn't be reduced to fit the dysfunction. You didn't simply leave the room. You outgrew the whole building. They called it abandonment, but it was really alignment. You'd stayed long enough to learn, see, and feel everything you needed to. But the lesson was learned. You'd completed the spiritual work, and the test was obvious. Could you go away from something that was comfortable yet toxic? Could you graduate without wanting recognition, retribution, or closure? You did. They didn't expect you to pass. In truth, they wanted you to stay in the loop, second-guessing yourself, proving your worth, and hoping that things would change. But something in you shifted. You stopped waiting. You stopped negotiating with chaos. And you realized that they would not be the ones to help you recover. It was going to come from within. That understanding became your permission slip to go. Allow them to say what they want. Allow them to distort the story. You do not need to correct them since the truth is permanent and clear in your results. You did not abandon anyone. You've just done sacrificing yourself. You did not disregard them. You climbed over them. And they didn't see it coming because they were too preoccupied scheming your downfall. They never expected you to create your own ending. You weren't expected to stay in that chapter forever. You were simply a guest star in a story that was never meant to highlight your full potential. You came, saw, grew, and graduated with your peace intact, your soul strengthened, and your future open. That wasn't a goodbye. That was evolution. And no matter how hard they try, the fact will not alter. You did not abandon the story. You've outlived it. They perceived your departure as the end. However, it was the start of everything they hadn't expected. What seemed to be calm was really a scheme. What looked to be weakness was divine calculation, and what appeared to be surrender was your highest degree of self-control. You didn't just walk away. You altered the rules by departing with your crown intact and your soul impregnable. You did not have to shout. You did not have to retaliate. You didn't need a crowd to root for you. Your very presence had already said volumes, and your removal completed the picture. And now you're living proof that elevation doesn't need explanation. You departed without vengeance, theatrics, or surrendering your core personality. That is power. That is odd. And this is why they are still spinning. because no one taught them that the most graceful goodbyes have the loudest echoes. So let them converse. Allow them to rewrite their side of the story. Allow others to assume you're the evil. History will expose what really happened, not by their words, but by your own growth. The luminosity, the artwork, and the intention. The work which does not seek authorization. The power that no longer needs confirmation. You did not just bear the circumstances. You exceeded it. You invented the suffering, the professor, the uncertainty, your compass, and the treachery. Your breakthrough. You have changed from the beginning. And thank God for that, because who you are now is unbreakable, unassailable, and immune to malfunction and public scrutiny. I'm still trying to find the strength to walk away. Remember that you don't need to blow yourself up to escape. Sometimes your quietest actions result in the biggest victory. The selected one. Your departure was more than just a choice. It was your development in motion. And you walked out of the flames not only alive, but totally. If this message strikes you like a truth bomb, do not scroll away. This is the place for genuine truth, spiritual clarity, and open healing. If you've ever had to walk away from people that didn't value you, making a quiet exit, it's changed everything. You're not alone. This channel was intended for folks like you and myself who have similar voices and experiences. Please do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel to guarantee you don't miss a word your soul needs. I enjoy this video. If it gave you chills, comfort, or courage, leave a comment and let's talk about your progress. Your story matters here. Share this with someone who is contemplating their own graceful departure. They should hear this. We are building a tribe of powerful, smart, spiritually untouchable creatures right here. And you are already one of us. Your healing is not quiet. It's a movement. Let us rise together. God bless you.